Today, we are with a well-known author, Manoj Mitta, author of the book Caste Pride Battles for Equality in Hindu India. The book which won three awards, one from Atta Galatta Bangalore Literature Festival, Kalinga Literature Festival, and Valley of Words. I think it got the latest award yesterday. Welcome, Manoj.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us today.
My pleasure.
Before we jump into the book, I would like to start our session by asking a few questions around journalism because you are a journalist at heart. You were a journalist before you became an author. So I would like to ask a question around the values of journalism. Do you think at this age, this modern age, maintaining those core values of journalism while doing journalism, has it become more easy or has it become more challenging?
No, one of the reasons why I left journalism in 2015 was because I was finding the space increasingly restrictive. It was not very conducive to the kind of freedom that was necessary for us to play the role of a watchdog institution. For me, that was what drew me into this profession. The romance of taking on people in power, holding them to account, and very fearlessly espousing public causes and all that kind of stuff, which was what drew me and many others like me into the profession, was becoming harder and harder to uh, do because there was what is now it's a notorious fact, especially in India. Um, It's happening apparently in other countries too, but the degree to which media freedom has been compromised in India is probably without a parallel. So there is hardly any space for that kind of combative watchdog journalism in the mainstream media. So you find more and more such investigative stories that are questioning people in authority. You will find them more in smaller online outlets which are not controlled by big business. So that's the
Right.
unfortunate trend. So instead of moving into those spaces and continuing as journalists, I decided to become a full-time author, and it also had to do with the subject I had by then undertaken. I had done a couple of books while I was very much a journalist, but this one, Caste Pride, it became very ambitious and it required full-time attention.
Awesome.
So I thought because journalism is anyway not so attractive anymore, not so conducive for the kind of journalism I want to do. So I thought I'll do this.
Jumping into the book, Caste Pride. Why did you name the book Caste Pride? And what were the other names you considered before naming it Caste Pride?
Well, I the book the title did create a bit of a controversy because it is possible for people to imagine that it's actually espousing uh, caste.
Mm.
The reality is far from it, as evident from the subtitle.
Mm.
The title is Caste Pride, the subtitle is Battles for Equality in
In
Hindu
Hindu
India.
identity.
So if you read that as a whole, I'm assuming that it does convey that this is not about valorizing caste, but it is about critiquing caste. And I wanted to also convey that this is not only about Dalits or untouchability or the suffering of the oppressed castes. This is consciously about shifting the gaze to the attitudes, the silences, the hypocrisies of the dominant caste, the upper caste, and the debates that took place in legislatures and courts. So I found it therefore an apt title because much of those battles were driven by this caste pride.
Yeah, and especially I am drawn to the word pride.
Yeah.
Why it is caste pride and not caste something else, right? Could it be anything that is not pride? Why you chose pride?
Pride is one concept that explains uh, the persistence of caste prejudice.
Mm.
That why is it that even in this day and age, when there's so much rhetoric about constitutional values and so much of development that the country is supposed to have undergone,
Mm.
so much technology, so much more exposure to the world and liberal values, yet you still see that caste is still thriving.
Right.
It's alive and kicking. So if people are still clinging to caste and it's that casteism, it is because they take pride in it. And it's not necessary that you have to be a traditional upper caste to feel that pride. Even castes down the line, they hold on to their identities and they become very aggressive about what they perceive as interference or a slight,
Mm.
an insult to their caste. So much so that even in this day and age, there are any number of instances of intercaste marriages leading to violence and in some instances even honor killings. And I'm not talking about what happened in some distant past. This is the reality of even the 20th century. The fact that even in this day and age, parents can kill their own children is an indication of how real this pride, this caste pride is,
Right.
right?
Right.
I mean, what else is explains
True.
this kind of bizarre, grotesque, inhuman reactions that something like caste, intercaste marriage evokes? I mean, it's the most natural thing.
Right.
If two people come together and they don't think about
Yeah.
caste.
Yeah. Yeah. The reason also, yes, you just wanted to touch that point because caste has a lot of components in it, right? It could be social, it could be economical, everything. But the word pride, personally for me, it was very apt because it is more psychological. So it repercussions maybe in the society and somewhere else, but it is within ourselves.
Yeah.
That is actually that makes caste, that is the pride, that one of the most important component or characteristics of caste. And also I believe that that's why uh, pride became or pride is the most important part that makes the battles for equality more challenging.
Yeah.
And I think that name was very apt for the book. And yeah.
Since you seem to suggest that pride uh, applies even to castes lower down in the hierarchy,
Right.
I may substantiate it by pointing out that when it comes to something like intercaste marriages, it is not only um, intercaste marriages between upper castes and lower castes that are leading to problems or violence, reactions that are crossing all limits of decency
Right.
or laws, right? Uh, there are also instances where, in fact, a lot of instances where uh, a backward caste community, uh, reacting very violently to a marriage in which one of the partners is from a Dalit community. And then what is equally bad is instances of marriages within Dalit community also, not being very conducive to castes across the that category. Castes that are victims of this reprehensible system, they internalize those prejudices
Right.
and they in turn uh, display those attitudes with those who are below them in that hierarchy.
Right. Right.
And that's something that even Ambedkar pointed out. I mean, it is such a that system of graded inequality is so pernicious that it compromises the morality of people at all levels.
Right.
The one who's above you will kick you, and you will in turn kick the one who's below you. That's the way caste system
Caste.
functions.
So let me move into the book, the contents of the book, right? The book itself is like a treasure for someone like me
Thank
who
you.
looks for factual data. So basically, this book uh, talks about the litigations or incidents of litigations that happened over the period of like 190 close to 200 years.
Not just litigation,
Mm.
it's about laws that were made.
Okay.
So a lot of the debates that I record in my book, uh, see, here's how it happened. As I said, I'm a journalist, so I my earlier books were about what we in India call communal violence.
Mm.
So I dealt with the two most egregious instances of communal violence: the 1984 Delhi pogrom, and the other one was the 2002 Gujarat massacres. Right. So one was targeting Sikhs, the other was targeting Muslims. Now, I mean, both are religious minorities. And the third book I wanted to write on was about mass violence targeting Dalits. And in the course of my profession, I had occasion to write about several of these instances which took place across the country in Andhra, Bihar, Maharashtra. So I thought I will do a book which focuses on why there was so much violence and why there was so much impunity for that violence, despite what is supposed to be a very stringent law. In the eyes of some, it is even considered a draconian law. I'm referring to the 1989 Prevention of Atrocities Act. Right now, on paper, you have a very tough law, but when I mean, there's been a spurt in violence, undeterred by the tough law, and there has been very little by way of justice, despite all the safeguards that are supposed to be in that law. Right?
Right.
So I wanted to examine this anomaly.
Mm.
But then when I was looking at those cases, I found that I was again and again running into this pattern of some arm or the other of the Indian state, be it the police, the prosecuting agency, trial courts, or even appellate courts, betraying what clearly seemed to be structural bias. Why do I say so structural bias? Why do I call it structural bias? It's because, it's not as if there's no evidence. There's no dearth of evidence. In spite of, the magnitude of the crime and in spite of the evidence being so strong, they would, these arms of the state would uh, exonerate the accused on the flimsiest of grounds. Why was this happening over and over again? Is the question I wanted to understand before I completed that book. But then when I looked at the existing literature, caste is another subject which academics have written extensively on, historians, sociologists, anthropologists, political scientists. But I could not find any proper explanation for the structural bias. The reason was that these books don't deal much with the legal aspects of caste.
Okay.
So there was a gap that I therefore felt the need to fill. This was not my original plan, but because there was this kind of a neglect of the legal aspects of caste, I had to look up the debates relating to the various caste laws and Untouchability Offences Act of 1950s, and then this Protection of Civil Rights Act of 1970s, and then this Atrocities Act of 1980s. So then I looked up the debates relating to the abolition of untouchability in the Constituent Assembly. Then I found that they are also referring to certain debates, unresolved debates, certain reforms that were attempted but blocked by sections within the Hindu community. Right? So I therefore found myself going into archives and looking at all these battles that were fought during the colonial period.
Right.
And I unearthed what turned out to be a treasure trove of unexplored legislative and legal debates.
Right. Not only the debates, not only the litigations, the courtroom litigation laws, but also how it converted into legislation.
How the laws were framed.
Yeah. how it impacted the forthcoming
How they were
legislation
implemented later in courts.
in courts, etc. Yeah, those were pretty exhaustively researched. So one thing I noticed was this was covered mostly during the book covers mostly that happened during the British time, right? Because one the
The
one
reason being
Hmm,
that it was only after the British rule came, uh, this modern notion of rule of law,
hmm,
this modern notion of laws being framed in legislatures after debates,
right,
and all those debates being duly recorded.
and it's a little more democratic, little.
There's far greater transparency, and there is, meticulous recording of everything
Hmm,
that went into the lawmaking, and then after that, uh, the interpretation of laws in courts,
right,
how those laws were enforced. Everything is recorded only from the time the British came into the picture.
right,
Before that, whatever happened is all in the realm of speculation.
correct, yeah.
That's why it's full of opinions that suit your political predilections.
And in some instances, those speculations were brought in during the discussions
Yeah.
during the litigation process as well. So one thing I noticed reading through few chapters, I made to complete it, but one thing I noticed was the British were showing complete deference to the existing caste prejudice at the time
Mm.
when they were making any law, mainly because, I don't know, you may correct me, mainly because they don't want to hurt the sentiments of the the local practices, caste practices. And they do it, they did kind of strategically to involve the majority Hindu population into the colonial fold. Is that what the British was trying to do?
Well, they uh, you must bear in mind that the colonial rule began in 1850s, sorry, 1757
Hmm,
with the Battle of Plassey. And then in those years, the initial decades, they were coming to terms with this creature called caste. They had no experience of it in their society. And then they got a whole lot of scriptures translated to understand. So they were working very closely with the Brahmins who were custodians of those scriptures, who were knowledgeable about those scriptures. So you had Bhagavad Gita being translated, you had Manu Smriti being translated. So they were beginning to come to terms with what is happening, getting into grips with that creature. So and then you had this amazing example. I mean, this was a time when they were still ruled. I mean, the rule was not by the government of Britain; it was by the company, East India Company. So it was only in 1857 or 1858 the transition took place, right? So now, if you look at that phase when it was under the company's rule, there were some exceptional reforms that they carried out, which had caste angle to it.
hmm,
For instance, sati. Sati was abolished in 1829 by the then Governor General, that
Benny.
is Benting, and he gave absolutely no quarter to the protests from conservative Hindus. And what is the caste angle to it? Sati was essentially practiced among upper caste, among Brahmins and Rajputs, predominantly in that. Lower caste had no such issue at all. If the husband dies, the woman can freely live. She could even intermarry. I mean, she could even have another marriage, right?
Right,
There was no issue. The problem was essentially of upper caste.
right.
So he uh, very unreservedly abolishes it. Now, after that, you look at another big example is this happened just before the revolt of 1857. In 1856, there was this another uh, landmark legislation, that is a law that allowed widow remarriage. Now, this was again something that upset a lot of upper caste people because they are accustomed to seeing women as their property, and they had these notions of marriage being something that you have several births, not just this birth.
Mhm.
So where is the question of and marriage being a sacrament?
Right.
It's indissoluble. So where is the question of a widow being allowed to marry another man. But there were serious reasons why they had to address this question, because a lot of those marriages in upper caste, 100% of those marriages would take place as child marriages. Even before they attain puberty, they would get married off. And there were many instances of those girls turning into widows at a very early age. Even before they started cohabiting with their husbands, they would have become widows. And then they were being condemned to widowhood for the rest of their lives.
Right.
And that was leading to all sorts of uh, controversies, because they could not uh, uh, legally have any relationships, but it was unnatural to deny them that. So there would be widows who were impregnated. So there were all sorts of churn going on in society. And it was in that context that somebody like Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar initiated that reform. There were some problems with that, but I won't go into that. But it was another big landmark legislation. So the point I'm trying to make is that it's after the 1857 episode, which again had a caste connotation in the sense that upper caste soldiers were very resentful of the rumor that was spread. Uh, I mean, I'm calling it a rumor because it's not established as a fact, that the cartridges that were used had some grease which had
Cows.
Fat.
Yeah.
So that was the basis on which Mangal Pandey, who was himself a Brahmin, and other Brahmins revolted. Right. So there was a caste angle to that too.
Yes.
Right. If it was just a matter of lower caste or Dalits, for them beef tallow would have been a non-issue.
Right.
So it was again something which upper caste made a big deal of. They said, look, you will, after that revolt subsided, Queen Victoria came out with a proclamation in which she promised that she'll be very sensitive to any issues concerning religious feelings.
Right.
And she will not interfere with them. She'll ensure that the government does not interfere with them. And caste was the biggest issue with Hindus.
But never
you could not interfere with their caste practices.
Right.
However rigid, however unfair they were to lower caste people or even to women. That was something which they were very particular about. So after that, they became very cautious. So in the beginning, they did show that spirit of seeking to reform caste. But post 1857, their attitude was that only when there is a consensus, only when there is a demand from within that society, they would allow that reform to take place. And that is how, in 1891, for instance, age of consent legislation, which tried to do something very modest, a very modest reform, that the minimum age of the girl should be not 10 but 12, just 2 years. Even 12 by modern standards is very low.
Yes.
Age of consent to have sex.
Right.
So that was how it was. And even that was protested by any number of conservative Hindus, including a man like Bal Gangadhar Lokmanya Tilak, who was considered a big icon, but in the context of caste, he was very retrograde.
So for a Hindu, how important is his caste?
For Hindus, religion is just a superficial coating. The real structure is caste. Religion is just a painting, a superficial layer of painting, because they are very liberal when it comes to religion. They're not very particular about any one form of worship, any one god, any one place of worship. Uh, they they have no particular doctrine, no particular dogma. You may believe this or you may not believe that. You may participate in this festival or not. Unlike in the case of other religions where everything was standardized. Here, you could do whatever you want in the realm of religion. But what was very rigidly enforced, what was non-negotiable, what was inviolable was caste. Caste rules they had to observe. So you can't intermarry. You can't interdine, meaning you can't even sit at the same place and eat with another person. You have to keep away from them.
Yep.
That kind of a. So you can imagine from that. And if you commit those caste offenses, religion can do nothing because religion allows. Religion on the face of it is quite liberal. You can even be a non-believer and yet be part of the Hindu religion. It was so open-ended. It was so loosely uh, functioning,
More flexible.
very flexible. But caste was just the opposite. That is what was operated at the micro level, in villages, in the, people were affected by that. So if you commit any of those so-called caste offenses, you would have hell to pay. You would be ostracized, or you would be penalized, or if you are boycotted, then you can't marry, your children can't marry.
Right.
So they would take those things very seriously. Now, all that happens through caste associations, caste panchayats. It was not through religion. Whereas in the case of other religions, had teeth like this, had powers like this. Whereas in the case of Hinduism, it was essentially caste.
Caste
You
has the
can't,
teeth.
a religious leader, uh, you know, can't expel somebody from Hinduism. It is the caste body that expels. So caste was the real deal.
Got
The religion is just a superficial factor.
Okay.
Mm.
So going back to my previous question, right, about British, how they approached the caste system in India in making laws and legislations. Whenever, even in the current term, right, in the current period, whenever we talk about caste, the one, or whenever we try to get into the discourse of caste with the right-wing folks who support Hinduism so much, one thing they put forth is caste is not something inherent to India. It was the Varna system we had. And this whole concept of caste is some kind of a British construct. Like, did British invent caste?
I'm familiar with this absurd proposition that the Hindu right-wing discourse makes. This is a desperate attempt to make the reality more palatable. Uh, there's any number of scriptural evidence of this kind of caste bigotry, caste intolerance. You have examples like, say, Shambhuka's, Shambhuka being killed by Lord Ram during what is considered utopia, that is Ram Rajya. So even in Ram Rajya, there was this kind of caste intolerance that was being practiced. That somebody said that this, I mean, why somebody, it Ram himself, when he comes across Shambhuka, he sees this as an unpardonable transgression of caste rules and immediately imposes death penalty on him, cuts off his head.
Especially in this particular incident, right? Whenever we talk about this Shambhuka's killing in the story,
Mm.
what the right wing come back and talk to us is, see, this might have happened at that age, right? It is not happening anymore, and it is kind of aligning with their current rhetoric of caste may have been an incident or item of the or a thing of the past. It is not happening anymore. Why are you still keeping on talking about that and keeping the caste alive? That is one other argument
But you're
they come.
shifting the goal. On the one hand, you say that caste didn't exist in the past.
Right.
Now, the scriptural evidence shows that it did exist in the past, and the scriptural evidence also shows that Varna, or whatever you may want to call it, caste is the English word, English equivalent of Varna or Jati. Just because it has a Western origin or it's the etymology lies in Portuguese or whatever, that's not the point of it. The point is that it's just being used as the English equivalent of what was happening. So, other argument which they give us, one is that absurd suggestion that caste was a colonial construct. The other suggestion they make is that originally caste was not birth based. It was something that allowed you to move into whatever space you want to be in. If you had aptitude to do a certain kind of work, you had all the freedom to go and do that kind of work, is what they suggest. Now look at the Shambuka example. He had aptitude to do tapas. He had aptitude to do religious austerities. On what basis did Rama say that he will not have that freedom? Because he was not born a Brahmin. So where is the question of having the freedom to do whatever you want to do according to your guna and karma? Shambuka episode disproves that suggestion. There are any number of such examples in Mahabharata also.
In Ekalaya
But
Bhaskara.
let us forget, Ekalavya or even Karna, they all had to face all sorts of problems, right? Or even Vishwamitra, forever fighting to get the title of Brahma Rishi. Why? Because he was born a Kshatriya and not a Brahmin, right? Now, let us look at, forget about these scriptures or mythology. Let us look at what happened in history. In the time of Shivaji, what happened? He had just escaped from uh, Aurangzeb's fort in Agra, uh, where he had a big confrontation with Aurangzeb, and Aurangzeb had refused to recognize him as a king. He treated him as a bandit, as an outlaw. So when he manages to escape from that prison, he goes back to his kingdom and says, "Look, I urgently need to be anointed as a Chhatrapati, officially conferred that title, so that I can talk to Aurangzeb on equal basis." Because he was justified in saying that I don't have an official status, so I need to have that. So what did the Brahmins of his kingdom, the Maratha kingdom, Shivaji's kingdom, say in response? They said, from where to get this notion that you can be anointed as a Chhatrapati? Here is this anomaly. By this yardstick of you know caste being determined by your qualities and not by your birth, Shivaji is an automatic candidate for the status of Kshatriya. He ticks all the possible boxes of Kshatriyahood. He was a brilliant warrior, a master strategist. He was a great administrator. So he had all the qualities to be a Kshatriya. And yet, Brahmins of his time, including his prime minister, said it's just the birth, the accident of birth that determines whether you are a Kshatriya or not.
So his prime minister was a Brahmin.
Yeah, his prime minister was one Pingale,
Okay.
who refused
Okay.
to be party to any such attempt to confer the title on him of Chhatrapati. Why? Because he was not born a Kshatriya. And they in fact said there's no question of there being any Kshatriyas in Kali Yuga. This is the medieval age. It's part of Kali Yuga. Why? Because in one of the Puranas, there is a story about how Parshurama has exterminated all Kshatriyas. So there are no Kshatriyas left in
Kali Yuga.
Kali Yuga.
So this was one of the legal arguments they made too.
They made before Privy Council in a case that was determined in 1857. There, a bunch of uh, people who considered themselves Kshatriyas, Rajputs, they went all the way to, because this litigation was going on, because these Brahmins were taking the position that right from Shivaji's days onwards, we have been consistently holding that there are no Kshatriyas at all. In other words, Brahmanism was one of the main reasons why India became vulnerable to these attacks, these invasions. Why? Because the elite section of Indians, that is Brahmins, were propagating this view that there were no people who had any martial qualities, any warrior-like qualities among Indians. There were only two varnas, is what they were saying. That there are Brahmins who were sattvic, and then there are Shudras who were tamasic, who were unfit to do anything worthwhile. They just, the best they can do is serve uh, Brahmins, and they are meant only to do menial jobs.
Sattvic and tamasic.
Yeah,
I heard this terminology in food too. Nowadays, the
yeah,
sattvic and
yeah,
tamasic
yeah.
food.
These are Kshatriyas were supposed to be Rajasic,
Okay.
full of passion and all that,
Mm.
right? So they took this view that there were that Indians, I mean, the elite Hindus were saying that majority of the Hindus were impure, unfit to fight, wars because they were not unfit to defend our country. So you are actually psychologically,
And this
running.
all in record. They said in record.
You look at on this is a well recorded matter of history that when Brahmins of Maratha land refused to confer the title of Chhatrapati on Shivaji, he had to send emissaries all the way to Varanasi, and there they looked around for a priest, for a Brahmin who was willing to help them. And they found one Brahmin called Gaga Bhatt, who it is rumored that he was paid off, whatever. And then he comes to their rescue by concocting one fancy genealogy for Shivaji. He says, yeah, it is true, as is the view held by a majority of Brahmins, that in an earlier yuga, Parshurama, who was one of the avatars of Vishnu, had exterminated all Kshatriyas because they had abused their caste status. So there are no Kshatriyas otherwise. But what happened was there was one small section of Kshatriyas somewhere in the Rajputana who survived that purge. And that is how you saw in the time of Akbar, you had some Sisodias. Rana Pratap was a member of
Maharana
that.
Pratap.
Maharana Pratap was a member of that Sisodia community. So the main Shivaji was a contemporary of Aurangzeb, who
Aurangzeb.
was a descendant. So they cited that precedent and said Rana Pratap, who fought so valiantly against Akbar, was a Kshatriya. So they, that genealogy which Gaga Bhatt came up with, in order to help Shivaji get the title of Chhatrapati against the wishes of Brahmins of his region, was that
So that he can.
this man was not actually not was not from Maratha area. He was not a Marathi speaking man. She had to come up with a genealogy which suggested that he was from Sisodia community in Rajputana in modern Rajasthan,
Mm.
and that is how he finally, through this Gaga Bhatt, becomes Chhatrapati.
So he found a logic to
Yeah.
validate his
Look at how
Kshatriya
perverse that is.
status. Yeah.
I mean, what does this
Even if it doesn't matter, we don't know if it really the genealogy is there,
Yeah.
but they just came up with a story to validate that
Yeah.
claim.
Yeah. So, I mean, as Ambedkar rightly said, that Brahmins would decide what your Varna status would be. They can confer that Varna status or take it away from you. They could. That's how, in his book called "Who Are Shudras," he came up with this theory that Shudras were originally Kshatriyas, but it is Brahmins who decided that you are not performing your duties as Kshatriyas, certain rituals you have to perform. So I refuse to therefore do that uh, Yagnopavita,
Right.
that Upanayana,
Upanayana. That
which is
thread
necessary,
wearing
that
ceremony.
sacred thread.
Mm.
So it is through that sacred thread that you become a Kshatriya, or you become a Brahmin, or you become a Vaishya. So the Brahmins decide who can. They are the ones who are custodians of. They have a monopoly on Vedic rites, Vedic mantras. So they kept it all to themselves. So they would decide whether they would perform that ritual on you and give you that status. So they decided long back that these two varnas, Kshatriya and Vaishya varnas, would go away. So in the 19th century, because of the availability of these modern institutions of legislatures and courts, and the scope for two parties to argue before a judge, and everything being recorded. Today, in the 21st century, we know now this kind of information is what is coming out for the first time in my book. I mean, and it can't be more authentic than, I mean, nothing can be more authentic than a court record or legislative record. So you have this kind of a debate that took place between Brahmins and, I mean, those who are taking that Brahminical view that Kshatriyas don't exist. And then there was that view that Kshatriyas still exist. So in 1857, Privy Council gave a ruling saying, taking all evidence into account, we come to the conclusion that Brahmins do exist. And then subsequently, in some case in Bombay, later in that century, it was Govind Ranade, who was the judge of the Bombay High Court. He decides in one case that Vaishyas also still exist. And he says, at least in the case of Kshatriyas, Brahmins had this excuse of Parshurama's purges of Kshatriyas. In the case of Vaishyas, even that fancy story doesn't exist. So Vaishyas do exist. So thanks to the British courts in the 19th century, the fourfold Varna system was reinstated. So these are all things that today's Hindu right wing knows nothing about. Why only Hindu right wing? I mean, even the history books that were written during the colonial period or the post-colonial period, during the rule of Congress rule, Nehru or Indira Gandhi, none of those books talk about these fascinating and very revealing battles that took place. Battles that would expose Brahminism completely, and how Brahminism was so harmful to Indian society. As I said, the Brahminism came in the way of the title of Chhatrapati being conferred on um, an exemplar of all the Kshatriya qualities, that is Shivaji, right? Why? Because of accident of birth. And today, because it's so difficult for them to defend uh, our scriptures, our that Brahminism, so they take another position. They would say that no, 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 uh, it's never based on birth. But here, you look at mythology, you look at history, there are any number of examples which show that that is how it was always interpreted. Why was Shivaji refused the title of Chhatrapati? Because he was not born a Kshatriya, right?
Right.
So can there be anything more glaring than that?
Right.
So we don't only have to think about mythological instances like what Ram did with Shambhuka. You have instances from history too. That same kind of bigotry, prejudice still on display.
Right.
And that goes on even in the modern age, right up to the 21st century.